Okay, so we are moving on now to talking about chapter 3 of the public policy textbook. In this chapter, we discuss the differences between public policy and politics, explore the factors that lead the government to create policy, evaluate the various theories of public policy making, and then summarize the stages of the policy process. Now, unfortunately, this chapter of the book is, I think, really where you start to see a lot of the ideological blind spots of the textbook showing up. So, as I've done in previous classes, I'll bring in some supplementary material to try to account for that as well. So I started by saying, explaining the historical context of U.S. government intervention. The Great Depression, World War II, marked rapid increases in federal government intervention. We've covered this already in previous classes. Federal policy has expanded to address civil rights, poverty, environmental protection, and worker safeguards. This basically ended, however, during the 1980s, or even really in the 1970s, right? Parenti sometimes talks about the last couple of years of the Carter administration being Reaganism before Reagan. And, if we want to take a deeper look at that, we would explore that more. But essentially came in, full bore, full force with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, which began to sort of, move away from the sort of New Deal approach, which had dominated basically from the 1930s through the 1970s. Reagan's philosophy: government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. This led to outsourcing government services to private companies, defense contractors, private prisons, school bus drivers are examples that they give. When should the government act? Again, here's where we start to see a lot of the assumptions talked about, with in a sort of taken for granted way. I'll go through their summary and then I'll try to explain that afterwards. Governments in liberal democracies, they argue, exist to serve the public by providing services that the market cannot or will not provide. So they talk about this term market failures. Market failures occur when the free market inefficiently allocates goods and services. The market is basically a social system in which individuals pursue their own self-interest by exchanging goods and services, which they believe and many others believe leads to the mutual benefit of everyone. However, when that system produces an inefficient distribution, meaning some people lack access to essential goods or resources are misallocated, the government often steps in. Put simply, as they quote here, the government acts when markets fail to achieve the conditions that justify their use. So you can see quite clearly that they assume that market exchange is sort of like the normal or default way, essentially, of allocating resources. The government's only meant to step in certain sort of exceptional circumstances, not as default, basically. Four reasons explain market failures: public goods, externalities, natural monopolies, and information asymmetry. Each of these conditions prevents the free market from operating efficiently on its own, creating a rationale for government intervention. So they are, essentially relying on a sort of neoclassical economic approach to explaining government intervention. Excuse me. Well, let's talk about some of the concepts that they identify here. So public goods are defined by non-exclusion and joint consumption, meaning that they are non-rivalrous. Non-exclusion means it is impossible to prevent individuals from enjoying the good, even if they do not pay for it. Joint consumption means one person's use of the good does not reduce the ability of others to use it. Because of these two characteristics, the private sector has no incentive to provide public goods. You cannot charge a price and exclude non-payers, so profits are impossible. Various examples they use: clean air, street lights, national defense, and public roads. Case in point, the Clean Air Act of 1970 and earlier versions gave federal and state governments the power to regulate air pollutants. Clean air is a public good that only government action can protect, since no company can profit by selling clean air. So when you come to situations where there's no sort of profit motive to provide these things, they argue that the government should step in and provide this, because it does provide an essential service, basically. And then they, distinguish private goods from other types of goods. Public goods from other types of goods. Private goods, I'm not going to go into this, but basically it's just the variations on this idea of exclusion and rivalry. So you have private goods, toll goods, common property, all different sort of variations. They either, meet or fail to meet one of those two conditions, basically. Moving on to the second market failure, externalities are effects of producing a good that are not the intended purpose of production. So a positive externality, a major sporting event like the Super Bowl, the Masters golf tournament, brings visitors who also spend money at local businesses not directly related to the event. The community benefits unintentionally. A negative externality, for example, are when coal-fired power plants provide electricity but also cause air and water pollution. Profit-maximizing firms have no incentive to limit pollution on their own. So again, this is another market failure. So the government role is to set restrictions on pollution levels and fine firms that exceed limits. Without intervention, negative externalities continue unchecked. So, again, and we'll cover a couple more, but basically these are examples where, the government is seen to play a role because the market provides no solution on its own. Basically, this is sort of, how you justify things from a fairly, mainstream economic view. Natural monopolies occur when startup costs are so high that having multiple firms is impractical. These are typically industries that require extensive physical infrastructure, for example, water, sewage, and natural gas services. Laying multiple sets of water or oil of water or gas lines would be enormously expensive and logistically absurd. So this provides another motivation for government intervention. The government either provides the utility directly or negotiate prices to ensure citizens are not priced out of the resource. So the government either takes over the role of providing the monopoly or it regulates the monopoly heavily, basically. Information asymmetry happens when a firm possesses a knowledge that the consumer does not. The firm could benefit from hiding negative information, but the government requires disclosure to protect consumers. So various examples, prescription drug companies know about adverse side effects from testing. The FDA requires them to disclose this information. That's why if you see a commercial on TV, which even the idea that pharmaceutical companies are allowed to advertise on TV is a interesting idea, but they'll have this long list of side effects or possible consequences from using that product. That's basically mandated by the government. Food labels, non-GMO labels, meat grade packaging, warning labels on cigarettes and alcohol. So why government is needed? The food packaging industry is unlikely to voluntarily share negative information. Government mandates ensure consumers have the facts needed to make informed choices. So again, these all provide reasons why, even in a market-centered approach, even if you accept the view that markets are normally a good way to allocate resources, there are still several shortcomings. And this then provides a rationale for government intervention, even if you accept the fact that the market is most of the time a good means of social and economic organization. They provide additional examples as well: large scale resource coordination, interstate highway system, public universities, public hospitals, sewage systems require government resources. Massive investments that arguably the private sector cannot come up with on its own. Natural disaster relief often requires government coordination as well. However, they argue that there are serious government failures that can develop from this as well. So there are market failures, but then some theorists identify what is known as public choice theory would argue that market failures doesn't necessarily mean that government intervention is necessarily a corrective, that it can lead to government failures as well. And they provide a very long list of this. I'm going to run through it, each one pretty quickly. And then after, like I said, I summarized their chapter, we can start to get into talking about this, because there's a lot of assumptions, that are sort of baked into this about market failures and government failures that are just not analyzed or made explicit in this text. So there are 10 reasons: inability to define social welfare, limits of democracy and the paradox of voting, inability to define marginal costs or benefits of public goods, political constraints, cultural constraints, institutional constraints, legal constraints, knowledge constraints, analytical constraints, and the timing of policies. Quite an extensive list. So government failures occur when a government does not leave society better off, particularly when it fails to correct market failures or even make conditions worse. So let's briefly run through each of these 10 points. Inability to define social welfare. The term social welfare, they argue, is inherently ambiguous. Different people and groups have different, often personal meanings of what constitutes the public good. Because social welfare cannot be clearly articulated or universally agreed upon, there is no sufficient way for government to intervene in market failures that center around needs that are vaguely defined. Policymakers cannot fix what they cannot clearly describe. Limits of democracy and the paradox of voting. Democracy hinders government intervention because voters and agenda setters behave unpredictably. The paradox of voting challenges the assumption that election outcomes reflect the will of the people. For example, if a voter's first choice candidate, for example, a third party candidate, has little chance of winning, the voter may instead vote for a less preferred but more viable candidate to avoid wasting their vote. I don't see why that is wasting your vote, by the way. The result is that an elected official may not truly represent the public's policy preferences, leading to government action or inaction does not serve social welfare. So people have this kind of weird psychology of voting where they want to vote for like the winner. So if they're not voting for the winning candidate, I guess they feel like they didn't personally, contribute to the victory of that candidate. So they feel that they have wasted their vote if they vote for a candidate that does not have a chance of winning. Well, the winning candidate would still win whether or not you voted for them anyway, right? I mean, one less vote isn't going to change that anyway. So you might as well vote for who you actually think is the best. By the way, I mean, this problem is fairly easily solved with what they call ranked choice voting, which allows you to basically vote for two different candidates. You vote for your first choice, and if that first choice gets eliminated, then your vote automatically goes to your second choice. So that's one fairly easy way you can solve the so-called paradox of voting. Inability to define marginal costs and benefits of public goods. Public goods like roads, national defense, clean air provide clear benefits, but their costs and benefits are extremely difficult to measure precisely. For example, the cost of building a highway includes contractor fees, which can be accounted for. But what about the cost of driver detours during construction or environmental damage? Benefits are equally hard to quantify. A new road may reduce congestion and accidents, leading to improved well-being, but well-being is not a quantifiable metric. Without accurate marginal cost benefit analysis, government intervention may be inefficient or misdirected. Political constraints. Even when policy would effectively correct a market failure, it may be impossible to enact due to a lack of political support. Politicians may be unwilling to risk their election prospects or spend political capital on a controversial proposal. If enough political actors oppose the policy, the proposal dies regardless of its political effectiveness. Political constraints mean that good policy does not always become law. Cultural constraints. Policy success often depends on public buy-in. If members of the affected community do not accept the values or goals of a proposed policy, elected officials may hesitate to push it forward. Now, again, usually these things are important to talk about, but usually these things are just sort of taken for granted that these so-called constraints just exist. Why they exist, we don't know, apparently, at least according from this so-called public choice framework. Even if policymakers are certain that policy will correct the market failure, cultural resistance can make enactment politically costly. Cultural restraints reflect the reality that policies must fit within the shared beliefs and norms of a society. But again, what shapes the beliefs and norms of a society is not really explored. Institutional constraints, the structure of government institutions, but I'll save my critique for after this. Let me just try to summarize without too much commentary. The structure of government institutions can limit policy action. Bureaucracy, separation of powers, federalism, and procedural rules all shape what is possible. For example, a policy that requires coordination across multiple agencies may fail due to bureaucratic turf battles I guess like the Crips and the Bloods or something. Or I said I wasn't going to do commentary. Or a lack of clear authority. Institutional constraints refer to the formal rules and organizational arrangements that slow, block, or distort policy implementation. Yeah, so this is some gesture to the notion of structure or strategic terrain, but it's not as defined as it would be, for example, in structural relational analysis, for example, that we've talked about in previous classes. It usually deals with more of the formal rules of institutions, not the sort of informal aspects of it as well. Legal constraints. Policymakers must work within a specific legal framework, such as the Constitution or statutory law. For instance, the gun control debate in the U.S. is heavily shaped by how one interprets the Second Amendment. Even if a policy seems efficient or desirable, it may be unconstitutional or violate existing laws. Legal constraints force policymakers to operate within boundaries that may prevent optimal intervention. Knowledge constraints. Sometimes the best evidence supporting a policy proposal is speculative at best. For example, one state considers legalizing marijuana before any other state has done so. Policymakers must rely on projection models to estimate costs and benefits, and those models are uncertain. However, once a first state enacts the policy, other states gain real-world evidence to guide their decisions. Knowledge constraints arise when policymakers lack reliable empirical data to predict whether an intervention will succeed. Analytical constraints. We're almost at the end. Policy justification often depends heavily on quantitative analysis, such as cost-benefit models, statistical projections, or program evaluations. Analytical constraints occur when those analyses may not be objective. For example, a policymaker might shape the result of analysis to increase favor for a proposed policy. To properly evaluate a policy, analysts would need to replicate the original study to check for bias or errors. Without rigorous, replicable analysis, government intervention may be based on flawed evidence. And finally, the timing of policies. According to Gupta, 4 timing-related issues constrain policymakers. There is a recognition gap. Policymakers must predict problems long before they become crises, but it is nearly impossible to foresee all issues that will affect social welfare. The problem may not be recognized in time to act. A prescription lag. Even after a problem is recognized, developing a suitable policy solution takes time. Adoption lag. Moving a policy through legislative or administrative approval processes is slow. Implementation lag. Putting the policy into effect also takes time, during which conditions may change. So that's it. That's heavily influenced by what is known as public choice theory, which again is another sort of adoption of neoclassical, basically free market economics into political science. And there's lots of problems, I think, with both these views. Both how public choice defines government failures, the concept of market failures, which I'll get into in a moment. Now, here's another example where they're just filled with all sorts of unstated assumptions. What values should governments pursue? The U.S. Constitution's preamble values justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, and general welfare. Except we'll ignore the idea of majority factions and preventing the redistribution of wealth and other so-called wicked ideas that Madison talked about in the Federalist Papers. Robin Williams, the sociologist, not the actor, defines American values as freedom, individualism, pragmatism, volunteerism, mobility, patriotism, progress, American dream, and equality. Okay. What is the goal of public policy? Ensure citizens are free to fulfill their aspirations. This comes from the social contract theory of John Locke. Minstrom's goals: defend people and property while maintaining public order, support effective non-governmental institutions, promote sustainability via regulations, taxes, incentives, fees, and subsidies, promote human flourishing and prosperity. Conceptualizing the policy process. It's a messy process and rarely moves smoothly from one phase to the next. So Harold Laswell's heuristic model, we've already kind of talked about this during the first class. It was a 5-step process. Here it's a 6-step process. He basically separates problem identification from agenda setting, where people usually tend to combine those 2 steps, I guess. Um, but again, the idea is to identify a public problem, which is an inherently political act, meaning it's not based on some sort of objective, neutral analysis. Depending upon your political views, some people will see one thing as a problem, and some people won't. Some people won't think it's a problem at all, like inequality. Um, Agenda setting. Attracting policymakers' attention to the problem, policy formulation, drafting policy in written form, debating the benefits and drawbacks of it, policy legitimation, how a bill becomes law, policy implementation, and then policy evaluation. Assessing the stages model. Strengths, it creates a manageable framework, so you can apply this framework to almost any policy, but it is a little too neat, and I think that's almost obvious without even having to explain that very much. But practical for understanding complex processes, intuitive and logical for students. So it's very basic. Like I said in the previous, it gives you a sort of a fundamental approach to understanding how the policy process works, as long as you don't take it too literally and realize that the real life process is, of course, a lot messier than this. Criticisms of this model: it produces fragmented research. The steps appear disconnected from one another. Assumes linear progression. Ignores feedback loops, for example. Not particularly scientific. Difficult to develop falsifiable hypotheses. Describes what happens without explaining why. Sabatier calls it stages heuristic, not a theory. Case study: healthcare as a market failure. Healthcare, or lack thereof, is a market failure requiring government intervention. So again, this approach, this neoclassical approach, can seem very conservative, and it is. I think there are all sorts of built-in assumptions that kind of lead people that way, but they're trying to use it in a way to show you that can even lead to sort of more liberal outcomes. So they're acknowledged that the healthcare system is a market failure. Interestingly enough, they don't define it as a public good, even though many other countries would, mainly because I guess healthcare is a profitable industry in the United States, but it's also been structured to be that way. We've allowed it to become a commodified industry. Two indicators of market failure: externalities and market imperfection. Positive externalities of healthcare: vaccination prevents disease spread, markets cannot ensure equal coverage, medical research funding enables breakthroughs, market imperfections: discouraging intervention, moral hazard, insured individuals may overuse care, for example, visiting doctor for minor needs. I've always thought this argument to be kind of unrealistic. So if you have better access to healthcare, you're just going to spend all your time going to the doctor and sitting in waiting rooms and things like that. I mean, who really enjoys doing that? I personally hate going to the doctor. I can never get in to see a doctor quickly. I usually end up, I'll talk to a doctor for 10 minutes, but I'll spend like an hour and a half waiting to see them. I don't see how having better health insurance would mean I would just be doing this, once a week or something. 20% of uninsured adults versus 3% of insured adults go without needed care. So you're much more likely to go without necessary and preventative care if you're uninsured, obviously, because then you're paying out of pocket. It's fairly obvious. Adverse selection stems from information asymmetry. Insurers charge higher premiums due to unknowns, pushing healthy people out of the market. Government intervention in the Affordable Care Act aimed to enhance positive externalities, minimize negative externalities, mandated everyone have insurance to eliminate adverse selection. Results were mixed. Many argue U.S. healthcare remains a market failure. And of course, the Affordable Care Act has not succeeded in making healthcare affordable in this country, which of course is one of its biggest failures, as well as the fact that you still have millions of people without insurance. So again, governments and liberal democracies serve the public by providing services the market cannot or will not provide. Market failures justify intervention. Governments do not always correct market failures. However, due to various limits, the policy and process involves more than moving a bill through the legislature. The 6-step stages model. The process is not always linear or precise. The model strengthens creating manageable frameworks for understanding each stage. That's essentially all of the discussion that you get of the policy process here. They never really question these assumptions that are sort of built into how we define market failures and things like that. So let me try to explore some of the things that I think are not talked about really at all. The chapter assumes market failure is the baseline justification for government. The entire logic flows from the market is natural, efficient. When it fails, government may step in. That's a distinctly neoclassical economic framing. It treats private provision as the default and public action as an exceptional corrective. So it's almost like a, use in case of emergency type of situation here. Not that governments may have, an enduring need to correct things, to sort of balance things, provide economic justice, etc. Which, again, these are different schools of thought, but they never really even address, any alternative point of view here. Reagan's quote, "Government is not the solution," is presented without critical distance. The chapter states the philosophy then describes outsourcing, but never interrogates whether that philosophy itself is an ideological claim rather than a factual observation about government failure. In other words, they just seem to accept at face value Reagan's idea. The section on government failures reads like a checklist of reasons to be skeptical of state action, mirroring public choice theory, which is itself a politically charged school of thought, a much more sort of right-wing approach to political science. And yeah, I mean, they just seem to assume that somehow government became the problem, whether it became too big or whatever. That's the usual reason that people give, but don't ever really explore the assumptions underneath Reagan's statement. The value section presents freedom, etc., as shared American values. Williams's list is treated as given, not as a particular and fairly dated sociological interpretation. What's missing? Any mention of competing values like solidarity, security, collective responsibility, or racial and economic justice. These things are just not there. The civil rights examples are cited, but the framing implies these are exceptions or extensions of individualism, not challenges to it. People have done research on this as well. The idea that American society is a highly individualistic society, and other societies are more collectivist, which is sort of treated as the opposite of individualism, is very much overrated. More recent research shows that Americans are very collectivistic in nature. They're very nationalistic. For example, there's a real tendency for sort of groupthink, herd-like behavior to develop in American society is very well documented. So the idea that all Americans are these highly individualistic people that think for themselves and I am the master of my own fate and that kind of stuff is very much an exaggeration. The stages model is presented as neutral, yet it implicitly favors incremental technocratic policymaking. It assumes problems are identifiable, agendas are set through orderly processes, evaluation is possible and used. This hides how power, money, lobbying, and media manipulation shape every stage. And again, this is never talked about. Critics, Deborah Stone, whose book Policy Paradox is cited elsewhere but not used, argues the stages model is deeply ideological because it obscures political struggle. So when they're using the term ideological here, they're talking about sort of dominant beliefs that conceal the inequalities that exist, or the power imbalances that exist within a society, and rather than explain those things, which should be a goal of science, particularly social sciences, to make these things explicit because they are real. It does the opposite. It obscures, it mystifies things, it conceals things that are actually going on, which are important for people to understand. Excuse me. The healthcare case study uses Mankiw, a conservative economist, and describes the ACA as having mixed results without weighing evidence. I would argue that describing it as mixed results severely underestimates the failures of the Affordable Care Act. The adverse selection, moral hazard framing are classic arguments against universal coverage. A more neutral treatment would also discuss how other wealthy nations avoid market failure entirely through non-market systems. Textbook claim: when should government act? So now I'm going to start bringing in Parenti again, who I think gives a necessary counter uh, a perspective to this, even though his book isn't necessarily on public policy. He does explore lots of issues which are, concerns of public policy. So again, going back to the textbook, governments in liberal democracies like the U.S. primarily exist to serve the public by providing services that cannot or would not be provided by the market. Government steps in only when the market fails to provide efficiently. The default, like I already said, is private market-based allocation. Parenti's counter argument from chapter 3 of his book, Democracy for the Few, challenges this idea, right? The US government does not primarily serve the public, it serves corporate capitalism. State power is used to support business interests, suppress labor, and manage crises for capital. Evidence from Parenti. Government sided with big business against workers in every major labor conflict. Government gave massive subsidies to railroads and corporations while ignoring public health and safety. The state intervened actively to capture fugitive slaves, crush strikes, and protect property, not to correct market failures. The textbook says government acts when the market cannot. Parenti says government acts to make the market work for capital, even when that means using violence. So basically, government action is basically there to benefit capital, not the public as a whole. If the textbook were true, why did the federal government send troops to break the Pullman strike but not stop child labor? So this notion that the public policy exists to serve the public presumes, of course, that the government is actually implementing policies which benefit people as a whole. But time and time again, when you actually deal with the historical empirical record, it's very hard to find instances where policy wasn't to the benefit of capital over workers, sometimes using direct force against workers on strike and things like that. I'm not sure. I put this in quotes. I'm not actually 100% sure if that is a direct quote from Parenti or just my own paraphrase of it, but it's pretty close to what he says. The 4 market failures. Again, market failures occur due to one of 4 reasons: public goods, externalities, natural monopolies, and information asymmetry. We've already talked about some examples of these. The textbook presents these as technical problems requiring technocratic fixes. So again, it tends to sanitize politics by pretending these are all just technical issues, not that these are all basically essentially life or death struggles, over the distribution of these resources and how these things are actually provided to people. The most important market failures are arguably missing from this list: exploitation and class inequality, which is not talked about as all. Parenti goes into a somewhat simplified view of Marxist theory, or a concise view of Marxist theory, I guess you should say. Workers produce more value than they receive in wages. This is not a failure. It is a successful operation of capitalism. Profit depends on it. So again, the system of commodity exchange would not be profitable if workers were not exploited, that they did not receive the full value of their labor with their wages. Otherwise, it would not be a profitable thing to do, and you would not exchange commodities, obviously, if you're not going to make a profit from it. So this is intrinsic to how the capitalist system operates, but is just not addressed at all. Externalities: pollution is not an accident, it is a cost-saving measure by firms. Government often allows it. Natural monopolies are some monopolies really natural? You can question that. Many, like oil, banking, agribusiness, are not natural. They are created through mergers, subsidies, and political favoritism. So the idea that they just emerge naturally, again, is a highly contested and probably false assumption. It's not just that these are, assumptions that are being made without considering alternatives, which is bad enough, is the fact that most of these assumptions here really don't stand up to any real critical scrutiny either. Especially when you go outside the theoretical realm and actually start, comparing this to, real life circumstances. Information asymmetry exists, but the deeper problem is that firms always have the power to shape what information is even asked for. So it's not just that they withhold information, that they basically structure the whole process by which knowledge is produced in the first place, and even where the sort of, research goals are. The textbook's list of market failures ignores that poverty, precarious work, and inequality are built into the system. The market is not failing when workers earn poverty wages. It is working as designed. And this is more or less what Marx would say. The top 1% owns 40 to 50% of wealth. Bottom 90% have little or no net assets. U.S. has highest inequality among industrialized nations. CEO pay went from 30 to 40 times worker pay to over 300 times the intervening decades as well. Is inequality a market failure or a market feature? Why does the textbook not list it as one? The textbook's top or 10 government failures. Government failures occur when a government does not leave society better off. Goes through the 10 reasons. These are all technical, cognitive, or procedural limits. The implication is that if we could fix those limits, government could correct market failures. Parenti's counter argument: failure is not a bug; it is a feature. The state fails the majority because it succeeds for the wealthy. So government failure is not an accident or a flaw. It is working as it is supposed to be working, because it is supposed to act more in the interest of the wealthy. This is how the structure was originally designed by the framers, and has continued to function in that way since then. So this goes back to what I said last class about how we consider the government to be functional or dysfunctional or not. If we consider the government from the sort of mainstream view of public policy offered here, then it seems the government's highly dysfunctional. But if its true function is to protect the interests of the wealthy, then it is actually functioning the way it is supposed to. So let's look at these different failures. I said I wasn't going to provide commentary on it. Well, now is the time to provide some commentary on it. It's a pretty long list. So I have to move things around a little bit here. The inability to define social welfare. Social welfare is deliberately left vague because elites benefit from uncertainty. I find that to be true. I think even this idea that we can't state what social welfare is. I mean, maybe you can't make a complete list of it, but there are certain things I think we would all agree should be on that list, like healthcare and housing and education and things like that. Do you think people are really living well if they don't have those things? I mean, it's just a very simple question to ask. Maybe you can't include everything that they need, or maybe it's going to vary, obviously, from individual, from person to person. But I think we could all agree that people that do not have access to healthcare, housing, education, food, things like that, obviously are being deprived of basic social welfare. This idea, we can't figure out what it means, is a cop-out, I think. The paradox of voting. Voting outcomes are shaped by campaign finance. The paradox is trivial compared to plutocracy, to the domination of the wealthy over the political system. Like I said, certain so-called paradoxical aspects of voting could be fixed by fairly minor changes, like ranked choice voting and things like that. The inability to measure costs and benefits. Costs and benefits are measured all the time, but for corporate projects, subsidies to oil companies, bailouts for the financial sector, all of a sudden they don't seem to have that hard of a time, figuring out what those costs are. Although you could argue that they did balloon far past what they originally thought. It didn't stop them from implementing these things because, we can't figure out, what the true cost is. Political constraints. Politicians don't act because they depend on wealthy donors. Culture is manufactured by media and education. Institutions are designed to protect property, not serve the majority. Laws are interpreted to favor corporate power. Knowledge is suppressed. or distorted critical research is punished. Analysis is shaped by funding sources. Corporate funded research dominates. The lag exists only for popular choices. Again, corporate bailouts basically happen overnight. So you can go through each one of these so-called, government failures and show that they are contain all sorts of assumptions that they're just not examined, basically. The government had no timing lag when it needed to send troops to break the Pullman strike or pass the Taft-Hartley Act to restrict unions. Which of the textbook's 10 government failures would explain why the U.S. is the only wealthy democracy without universal health care? Or does Parenti's explanation fit better? Values government should pursue. Again, the textbook list of American values offered by not the actor, Robin Williams. The textbook presents these as broadly shared, positive ideals. Example, America's sense of individualism. Individuals must strive to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. These values are ideologies that justify class hierarchy and exploitation. So this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is just a way to make the hierarchy of classes that exist in society seem like a natural thing. The people on top are the people that did pull themselves up by their bootstraps. The people on the bottom are the people that fail to do so, and it's their failure, basically. That's how you justify hierarchy. Blame the poor for their poverty, denies structural causes. Pragmatism, the sort of can-do spirit that avoids questioning the system itself. Patriotism, national pride, obscures imperialist and exploitative policies. The American dream, rags to riches, mobility is extremely rare. As George Carlin says, they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. Equality, the textbook says governments pursue equality. Well, where's the evidence of that? I mean, if that's true, then they're doing a very bad job of it. I mean, America is obviously is arguably never been more of an unequal country than it is now. I mean, America's always been an unequal country. So the level of inequality that exists now could only really be accurately characterized as extreme levels of inequality. Parenti argues that formal legal equality masks vast material inequality. Without economic justice, political equality is a sham. The ideology of poverty framed as personal failure, structural causes ignored, wealth equals worth, justifies unequal distribution of resources. Again, I don't know why I put that in quotes there. It's a typo on my part. Chapter 5 of Parenti also notes that education reproduces these values uncritically, which I argue, quite frankly, to get a little meta here, meta textual or whatever, I think our very own textbook is an example of this. Schools present sanitized views of U.S. history, ignore labor struggles, and punish critical perspectives through rejection, lack of funding, inability to get your stuff, your work published, basically. If a student wrote a paper arguing that individualism is a tool to resist a living wage, would the textbook's framework allow that argument? Why or why not? Goals of public policy. Defend people and property, support effective non-governmental institutions, promote sustainability, promote human flourishing and prosperity. Very generic kind of list that almost everyone would agree with, of course. But, what does it actually mean in practice? Human flourishing includes social equity, civil rights, and human dignity. The textbook implies the government acts to achieve these goals only when markets fail. Parenti's counter-argument, under capitalism, government's real goal is to stabilize the profit system, not to help people flourish. Even the New Deal should be examined in this way. Textbook presents New Deal as a government acting for the public good. Parenti argues that it was aimed primarily at stabilizing capitalism, not transforming it. Many programs benefited large corporations and agricultural elites. Relief was limited and uneven. African Americans and domestic workers were excluded. Real gains came from pressure below, strikes and protests, usually led and carried out by various, socialist parties in the United States at this period of time, including the Communist Party. Evidence from Chapter 4, 37 million people living in in poverty, 13 million children, 36 million facing hunger. These numbers have probably only increased since Parenti wrote this in 2011. U.S. ranks 49th in literacy, 37th in healthcare, highest incarceration and infant mortality. If these are outcomes of market-centered policy, where is the flourishing? Flourishing, again, only seems to really come at the very top. A truly democratic policy would prioritize economic justice, public ownership of necessities, worker control, radical redistribution. The textbook never considers this because it's outside the market failure frame. The textbook says policies should promote human flourishing using Parenti's data. Is the U.S. flourishing? If not, why does the textbook not treat that as a policy failure? The 6 stages of the policymaking process. It still presents policy as a rational step-by-step process where problems are identified, solutions are formulated, and outcomes are evaluated. The stages model omits power, violence, and ideology. It describes a process that never actually happens as described. So what good is outlining steps of a process if that process never actually unfolds in reality? Who identifies problems? The wealthy and corporations have enormous power to define what counts as a problem. Agenda setting, again, the public agenda is shaped by campaign contributions, ownership of media, and corporate lobbying. Issues that threaten capital never reach the agenda. Policy is often written by industry insiders. Corporations gain significant autonomy and influence. Regulations on businesses were removed or severely rolled back. Violence and repression are not in the model at all, yet strikes were crushed, unions declared illegal, and dissent suppressed, both historically and now, in the present day, when you see people protesting. Bureaucrats are not neutral. They are shaped by class interests. Universities are run by unelected boards of affluent individuals who play a role in the supplying the bureaucrats who then go on to staff these agencies. Evaluation is often funded by the very programs being evaluated. Critical evaluation is suppressed. The most effective control is unconscious and internalized. The stages model is part of that control. It makes students think policy is a technical exercise, not a battlefield of class interest. Can you name a major policy that never went through the problem identification stage as the textbook describes? Who identified the problem and how? In other words, things like Trump's tax cuts from his first term were basically just, rammed through Congress without any real public debate over these things at all. In fact, most people would argue the taxes being too high, especially on the wealthy, was not a problem that needed to be addressed. In fact, most people support higher taxes on the wealthy. Textbook on healthcare as a market failure. Again, the textbook treats lack of universal coverage as a technical market glitch. The the Affordable Care Act presented as a corrective intervention. It states that there are mixed results, but no analysis of why the results were mixed. And again, I think even that terminology tends to understate things a little bit. According to Parenti, healthcare is not a market failure. It is a commodity in a system that prioritizes profit over need. Production guided by profit, not social welfare or environmental sustainability. Under production of necessities over production of luxury goods. Insurance and pharmaceutical industries are among the most profitable and politically powerful. The ACA had mixed results, of course, because it preserved private insurance and pharmaceutical profits. So it left in place the for-profit structure of healthcare. It did not challenge the power for profit healthcare. Public options killed by industry lobbying. Millions remain uninsured. Costs continue to rise. Alternative to this would be, single payer, public provision, removal of the profit motive, but that would threaten the owning class, so it never reaches the agenda. Every other wealthy democracy has universal coverage, lower costs, better outcomes. Why? Because they treat healthcare as a public good, which the textbook itself introduces this concept, but the U.S. does not, and never really explains why healthcare is not or should not be considered a public good. Of course, the main reason would be the corporate power blocks it. Again, we've essentially allowed healthcare to become a profitable industry. which is why it's not a public good. Using parentheses framework, explain why the U.S. spends more on healthcare than any other country, but has worse outcomes. Now explain it using the textbook's market failure analysis, which is more convincing to you. So this would be a good exercise for you to do on your own. Again, another table here, why the government acts. Try to move this out of the way so you can see here. Correct market failures, public goods, externalities, etc. Serve corporate capital, suppress labor, stabilize capital. So now we have two contrasting point of views. The sort of mainstream, let's call it neoclassical approach, says government acts to correct market failures. Prenthe, who was a Marxist, argues that the government acts to serve corporate capital and suppress labor and stabilize capitalism. Market failures result from inefficient allocation. Market failures for Prenthe include things like exploitation, inequality, poverty, but these are really features of the market, not failures. This is part of how the market normally operates. Government failure stems from technical knowledge and timing constraints. Government failure for Prenthe stems from the fact that it's captured by the capitalist class. And the state works for the wealthy. You could also add to that more of a structural analysis that the structure of the government itself is already predisposed to, favor capitalist interests. Values, individualism, liberty, patriotism, the American dream are really just ideologies that mask class rule. The policy goals are supposed to be human flourishing and social equity. The real policy goals, according to Prenthe, are profit maximization, capital accumulation. Again, which one to you sounds more realistic? Stages model, it's rational. Prenthe would argue that it omits the presence of power and violence and ideological control, which shapes the policymaking process. Healthcare is seen as a market failure, whereas from Prenthe's approach, it stems from the fact that healthcare is treated as a commodity, which has become very profitable for certain corporations. All right, so that pretty much wraps this up here. So we will continue with this with chapter 4. Okay, so take care, everyone.